right. Give this a second to re-spool up. Everything takes longer when you're doing it online. I'll make sure to see it's live. Here we go. We'll give it a second. And then we're going to jump back into part 3 of Marx. We should get near the end today. We might spill a little bit over into next week for the students. Next week we are going to spend a day at least, almost maybe 2, maybe a day and a half on draft writing, especially using Turabian. So we're going to spend some deep diving into Turabian. So if you haven't looked at your Turabian book yet, now's the time. But we are going to finish Marx if we have a little spillover, and we're going to start Benedict Anderson, who is our famous and Asian studies / postmodernist guy. So we're going to start him too. He is coming. And I still haven't decided 100% if how we're going to do the presentations yet, but they're coming. We're going to have some form because I still want you guys to get each other's feedback. The grade is less relevant than the actually getting help from other people. All right, let's get started. And as per normal, please ask questions in the stream chat or in the 492 chat in our Discord. All right, let us... Oh, how did I lose that already? Here we go. Let's begin. All right, and I'm pretty sure we finished Theory of Capital. Here we go. We finished at the end of this page with a little bit of how Marx uses Hegelian ideas. Now, to remind you, right? This is where I'm probably the first op-ed I truly add is this one here, where the Marxists still refer to Hegelian concepts, specifically the general will and freedom. And to remind you, the general will means you have an ability to understand what the people want democratically, but without polling and without asking them. You just know. How? Well, if you know Marxist theory, you just know. That is, scientifically is what they'd say, but you just know. Now, if you're like, Professor, that sounds like religion or magic. Yes, it does a bit. Welcome to every belief system has its holes, and this one can be kind of gaping big. Now, freedom in Marxism, whenever a Marxist says freedom, and whenever a Hegelian says freedom, they do not mean your freedom in the way we think it. They mean freedom to conform to the general will. That's what freedom means. Now, if you're like, Professor, that does not sound like freedom. Welcome to Marxism, which also invented political correctness. Which is mean you don't tell what is real, you tell what the party wants you to say. And even though Soviets had it, the Maoists made it the penultimate form. But we'll get into that later. Okay. So now we're going to get into, again, Marx on accumulation of capital. Now, so far, if you've been like, Professor, how do I use this to analyze, Japanese samurai in the Tokugawa? We'll get to that at the end. Let me finish explaining all the theory as fairly as I can, and then we'll get into how it's an analytical tool and some of the parts that might be missing. Okay. And again, because this is pretty dense, normally I should just ask me questions at the end, but as you have questions, feel free to ask them in media res, right, as I'm going, and I'll try to clear it up as we're going along. It does seem to go better, especially when we're doing deeper theory. And you thought Mill was fun, right? Marx is the next level down the rabbit hole. Okay, so first thing, talk about how we get capital in, and how do we accumulate capital in Marx's theory when we're in a capitalist society. And remember, this is an interesting part to point out by now. Most of Marx's work is on diagnosing capitalism. It is not on pre-capitalism, and it is not on what socialism is, but you infer what socialism is from what capitalism is doing wrong. That's how socialists and Marxists get a lot of their answers. But we're still only talking about capitalism, which is still basically where we are. So, all right. So the first, for this system, you need competition. And part of this competition is you use competition as an excuse to replace labor with machines. Man. Now, why would you do this? Well, you have to do this in a Marxist conception, otherwise wages would increase and decrease profit. Now, if you remember, profit is just the wages that are due to the workers. So, what is a way to prevent this? It's replacing labor with machines. Now, if you've ever heard of, oh, automation and we're replacing machines, blah, blah, blah. A Marxist would say, and I don't even if you're not a Marxist, it's hard to say they're wrong. It's basically a gambit to not pay workers more for their productivity. That's what I would say it is. And a Marxist would say that. And here's the thing, you don't have to be a Marxist to think some of their diagnosis might be correct. All right. Now, this is, we're going to get an interesting attack here. Oh, where am I going? Yeah. He attacks a guy called Weber, and if you've never read, he attacks the idea of hard work, frugality of Max Weber. If you don't know who Max Weber is, Max Weber, and why am I saying Weber? Weber, because Weber is a German name, and if you become famous, we will say your name correctly. The pleasure of every language is to say non-native names wrong. Now, those of you who think it's just an Anglo-United States thing, you are sadly mistaken. Every single language mispronounces names. My name in Japanese is Jeffuri. My name is not Jeffuri, it's Jeffrey. It's 2 syllables, not 4. Now, do they mess that up because they hate me, or do they mess that up because that is literally how the structure of language works? Well, that's how language works. Can I give you another example? Sure. My name doesn't exist in Spanish, so most people just call me Jefe, which means boss. That is not my name, and that's not a Spanish name, and there is no way to adapt my name easily to Spanish. Welcome to how languages work. So, but if you get famous, we will say your name right. That is the rule. So if you're Max Weber, we will say your name Max Weber. So he wrote a book that this introduction just poo-poos and runs away. It's called The Protestant Work Ethic and Capital. It's basically the Protestant work ethic and capitalism. Like how working hard and having frugality cause people to be wealthy. For Marxists, they hate this. They hate it so much. They hate the idea of hard work. They hate the idea that, through my own good labor, I can become wealthy. For Marxists, they don't like to deal with that, because why? Is Weber wrong, or does it hurt their theory? A Marxist would say, Weber is wrong. It's just the Marxist answer would be, Max Weber is wrong. Hard work can't make you rich. That hard work, you're just exploiting somebody else, or even exploiting yourself. Marxists even gone that far. Now, for a non-Marxist, what you would say is, Max Weber in his Protestant work ethic book, Max Weber's a counter-argument to Marxism, and even a disproof. So again, it depends on your ideology. What's the third-person answer? I'll give it to you later. Remind me and I'll tell you. So okay, now why does a Marxist not like Weber's idea? Because this is the underpinning for how all capital is accumulated. No capital is free of this metric. Capital all comes from, and this is a quote, large-scale piracy, robbery, violence, theft, enslavement of men, and trade in slaves. For a Marxist, fundamentally, this is why we're talking about capital, all capital comes from these things. Now, remember how I mentioned right before this, how there's the general will, and freedom means being forced to be compelled to follow a rule? Now, why would I point that out? Well, I'm going to show you real quick. Okay. Here we go. What does freedom really mean? A state of exemption from the power or control of another. Liberty. Exemption from slavery, servitude, confinement. Freedom is personal, civil, political, and religious. Particular privileges, franchise, immunity. The power of enjoying franchises. Exemption from fate, necessity for constraint. So, hello. So, you got to remember, for a Marxist, words don't always mean what they mean for everybody else. So when I say violence, right, we're saying stealing through conquest, robbery means I steal from you, theft means stealing, right? But so for a Marxist, all profit is basically violence. So if you've ever heard recently people will say words like words are violence, and you're like, but they're the opposite of violence. No, but you've missed kind of the philosophy. You're using a different framework than that person is, because in the Marxist conception, right, things that are, how can I say it? Marxists have permission to redefine words as they match their theory for themselves. For non-Marxists, you'd say that feels dishonest. But again, they're allowed to do that. But so for a Marxist, capital can only come from these negative things. Therefore, right, morally, all capital is evil. if you wonder why Marxists don't like capitalist systems, right? They think all capital comes from basically being a pirate, from a robber, being violent, stealing, and enslaving people. And as we talked about before, right, because workers are forced to sell their labor, right, it's basically theft or virtual enslavement in a Marxist conception. That's just how they see it. So, and you can't dissuade them of this. If all those previous steps are true, Marxists feel that this step is also true. They would even say a hard-working, frugal, self-employed person is stealing from somebody. We just don't know who it is yet. So they could be stealing from their kids or from their employees or, from somebody else in their life. Like, there is no just accumulation of capital. That, if this is going to mean anything to you, the summary of it is, and I have a note here I'm going to read. The belief that capital is theft is fundamental belief to the belief system. People cannot make themselves rich, only steal from others. This is another belief, by the way. It's non-scientifically provable, but explains many things, such as Marxist critiques of colonialism. I should not have to say it, but reminder, to Marx does not mean is. So, for a Marxist, this is very true, and it's a fundamental first principle. To a non-Marxist, it doesn't mean it's true, but it's good to know this is how Marxists think. You can now understand their work better. All right. So, and he would basically say that the introduction writer, Mandel, would say Marx basically critiques successfully this, the refutation of the abstinence theory of profit, aka, if I am able, through my own abstaining of consuming, to make more profit from my own work, to then turn into capital, that can't be theft. That's logically consistent. For a Marxist, though, they don't think that's true. They think that, this is obvious. Like, obvious, this is disproved because all capital comes from evil things. So basically, they would just say we don't know if the how can I say it? They would say you wouldn't know. Just because you don't know the cause doesn't mean it's not theft. That would be their answer. So they claim to have disproved Weber. As a non-Marxist, I would say it's not that clear-cut. Anyway, some problems. And this is the translator again, Mandel, giving us an honest thing. There are some problems here, though, from the theory in real life. First, when capital increases, wages do also increase together. So this can look like a refutation. Now, how does he argue it? Well, he would say the end goal still is to reduce the value of labor power. So even if capital is increasing and wages are increasing, the end goal is still to reduce the value of labor. Now, how is this done? Well, if it's not happening in one country, then it's happening on the world scale. So, for example, there's a transfer of wealth from poor pre-capitalist nations to capitalist ones as the goal of imperialism, right? So, say a country is being decently just to its own workers, well, then it's transferring wealth from poor countries to rich countries, which then would be, for a Marxist, unjust capital accumulation. I'm trying to think of something else here I missed. Let's see. No, we'll get there in a minute. So, but yeah, there's still a transfer of wealth going on. So even if a country somehow manages to, increase capital and wages, Marxists will find a way to say, but they're imperially building things in other countries and transferring wealth. Now, remember, it doesn't have to be just conquest from imperialism. Old school Marxists would be against manufacturing in China too, because you're both hurting U.S. labor by decreasing United States wages and hurting the labor power of United States labor workers, and you're exploiting slave or super cheap labor in China. Both of those would be immoral for a Marxist. All right. Now, this process degrades the worker's situation eventually. And if you remember, that is the goal. Let me go. 7. Here we go. Okay. And over time it degrades the worker. So a capitalist system basically strips the worker of his rights, his dignity, and his need to develop it as a person. So the end goal for a Marxist of this capital accumulation is to strip workers of their rights, their dignity, and their needs to develop. They just treat them like a cog. This is the Marxist critique, by the way, just pointing that out. All right. And then the accusation here is the capitalist economy thus is a gigantic enterprise of dehumanization because money making is the goal. What should the goal be if it's not money-making? Well, again, right, the goal for a Marxist would be well-being of the labor first, because all value comes from labor, and all capital is basically stealing from labor. So, this is the accusation. So the flip side would be the morally good thing. So this is where the big critique of capitalism comes from under Marxism, this capital accumulation. All right, any questions about this so far? And again, if this is unjust, literally the next bullet point in Marx's theory of wages. So what would be a fair wage, for example? So we'll get into that next. And I'll give you all a second to type questions, but if you don't have them, that's fine too. I'd be a little shocked, but you never know. Maybe you all read it and it's very obvious. For somehow I doubt that, but you know, hope springs eternal. All right, I don't see any questions, so let's keep going. Okay, Marx's theory of wages. What is this? Well, first, there's a false attack, which is something like, this is what the translator says, of pointing out that there is not actually constantly decreasing wages in capitalist countries. Therefore, the Marxist critique is wrong. Let me say that again. Marx's claim, if capitalism is doing all this dehumanization, then in fact, wages should be going down, right? And exploitation should be going up. So it's not happening, so Marx is wrong. Remember how I said last time how for a Marxist they can say anything in the short term is proved right in the long term? So short-term things don't disprove Marx? That's this too. Okay, so they basically say just because wages aren't going down doesn't mean they're not getting worse. So Marxists have a different calculation besides the absolute monetary value of how wages should be conceived. Basically. Now, how should it be conceived? There's two. There's physiological needs plus historic moral needs. Interesting. Now, if you remember last time, we actually talked about it. Mandel said, "Oh, we're not going to necessarily talk about morals here, but we bring morals in. It's a moral system, by the way. So physiological needs, basically what you need to live. That's what a physiological need is. A historic moral need, we'll get into the details, but historic moral means is basically what you feel like you need based on your country and the state you live in. I'll give us more details as we go." So he points out wages under Marx's theory will be different in different levels of industrialization and affluence. Oh, do I have that here? Oh, boop, 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 beep, boop. I'm just double checking what I have. Okay, yeah, we have it here. So, but like historic moral needs, to give you an example, I'm looking at my notes too. Let's see. I didn't really explain it much here, but I'll point out a couple things. So, for example, historic moral need could be like the idea that you need a cell phone. Or in Southern California, you need a car. Does that make sense? They're not physiological needs. You're not going to starve to death without a cell phone or a car. But think about it right now as a college student. One of your historic moral needs is literally access to the internet and some kind of typing device and some way to see my broadcast. Right? Without that, you literally couldn't be in the class. So for a Marxist, that would be a historic moral need. Somebody says internet is greater need than a car. Yeah, and especially nowadays. And a Marxist would say, oh, that's become a historic moral need now. So we have to consider that when we think about wages. So, and like I said, salaries are different levels of industrialization. This should be obvious. Like, it's not injustice, even for a Marxist, which is interesting to say. Like, workers in China and workers in America make different amounts of money. A Marxist would say, of course they do. They're different levels of industrialization. To expect them to be the same wage is incompetent. And again, right, folks, if you've never been to China or, let's say, developing countries, stuff is also commensurately cheaper for a reason. All right. Now we get into what he calls capital wage theory. So this is how does a Marxist determine wages in a capitalist system? That's why it's capital wage theory. Now, if you're like, Professor, what does this mean? So for a Marxist, rules change depending on the socioeconomics. So if we're in capital socioeconomic capitalist, these are the rules. But if we become Marxist, socialist, then the rules change again. Or if we're feudal, the rules change again. Now, why is that nice? Well, if systems that are feudal or socialist kind of disprove a Marxist, they can just say it's the wrong socioeconomics. So, all right. So first thing the Marxists would say, and Marx says this himself, actually. So this is to explain the accumulation of capital wage theory. First, he would argue, even though wages don't look like they're going down, there's a relative decline in wages. So even though wages haven't gone down numerically, what your wage can buy has, in fact, decreased. So, like, $20 today doesn't buy what $20 would buy 20 years ago. It's not just inflation, but it's just the things you need relative to your income have changed. Or, rent in Southern California. Also, class struggle and demand choice of new products into minimum standards for workers. So, another thing that affects theory is the class struggle, right? Like, the owners want to get as much as they can, the workers want as much as they can. And then there's this, what they say, demand choice for new products into minimum standards for workers. So basically, the people who are paying, in a Marxist mindset, the employers never want to pay more, and they don't want to acknowledge new minimum products and what is a good standard expectation for a worker. And workers' interest is to always have more things added to what is considered the minimum standard. So, for example, do you have to make enough money just to food and clothe yourself, or do you have to make enough money to, like, afford 2 cars and the internet and a bunch of electronics? So that's what a Marxist would argue is also part of the theory. Next. The value of labor power is also linked to long-term supply. And this one is actually just a market principle. It's not just a Marxist principle, right? If there's too much supply, what happens to the value of labor power? If there's too much supply, the value goes down. I know this is unpopular to say, but I'm going to point out, folks. So, for example, let's say I'm a capitalist. I would like migration, legal and illegal. Why? It forces down the value of labor over time. More people competing for the same amount of jobs helps employers, hurts labor. So, but even in an economy, right? Let's say we have a self-contained economy, birth rate affects labor power, right? We have more people. Hypothetically, it affects the long-term, that would be increased long-term supply, which decreases labor power, although those people also consume. So there's something to be said there. Also, there's a maximum rise in the level at which surplus value is deleted, then it hurts labor. What this means is, if you remember, surplus value is our euphemism for profit. So there's only so much surplus value you can take before you really start hurting labor. So companies can only decrease your salary so long until it actually starts hurting your livelihood. Also, there's another problem here. Intense exploitation leads to burnout, which leads to a need of more labor. And when Marx wrote, he would literally talk about, like, getting your legs cut off in a factory, right? Like, you can only work so long until it's not safe, you get your legs cut off, or you burn out or have a psychological collapse, and then somebody else has to replace you, right? So part of what affects wages too is how much is there burnout, right? If you're too exploited, you will burn out. This is just even though it's a Marxist observation, you could say it's a fact, right? If we burn a higher percentage of our labor force, we need more replacement labor. And again, this affects how much people get paid. So this is how a Marxist would say you can kind of calculate wages. And what's fair wages, what are good wages? It's some combination by your basic needs, your historic moral needs, the level of industrialization, all of these factors here too. All right, and continuing going on. The theory of relative impoverishment. Let me find this. Okay, and this means, relative means it's not objective, right? It means it's changing over time. It's relative deprivation is the idea, or relative impoverishment. That just because you don't look poor doesn't mean you don't feel poor. So, for example, over time, Marx would say, productive workers slowly receive a smaller share of the value they create. So even though you're still getting paid theoretically well, your actual level of impoverishment is increasing. An easy example of this would be like if you're a heavily productive worker in Southern California, and you might have gotten paid, I don't know, $50,000 in the 80s, and you get paid $50,000 now. Just because the productive worker gets paid that amount, that $50,000 now does not feel as good as it did in the 80s. And even when wages rise, human needs surpass the wage rise. So, for example, Marxists would say our historic moral needs increase faster than our wages increase in a capitalist system. So, but they call them needs, not wants. So they always say your needs are always more than your wages. And also, general relative impoverishment eventually leads to absolute impoverishment. So for a while, you know, stuff's going up, but you still can't afford everything. But at some point, there'll be some crisis that leads to absolute impoverishment. That is where, like, you're at a zero and you can't escape, right? No money, no job, lots of debt, no connections. So for a Marxist, all this relative impoverishment eventually leads to absolute impoverishment. And as we said, from a Marxist perspective, that's actually the goal of capital and capitalist system, from a Marxist point of view. All right, any questions? No questions. I'm either explaining it really well or you guys are totally lost. So we can always go back to, if as we're going forward you have questions, I'm happy to go back to explain something again. All right, let me open this. Let's keep going. Oh. Great. All right, so Marx on money and the future. I think this is the... I'm looking now. Okay, somebody says I'm explaining it well. Well, thank you. But this is our last official slide. Somebody asks, so in a sense, as civilization society progresses, so will capital and profit. Yes, and for a Marxist, in original theory, they would say, eventually capitalism has to eat itself and then naturally lead to Marxism, like socialism. That's the natural progress for a progressive thinker, or for a Marxist thinker. So eventually profit and capital will eventually destroy labor and then lead to an uprising, which leads to workers retaking control. Because there's only, you can only work so long, and you can only impoverish so many people before they want to burn down your mansion. So, again, that's just a historical point, not a Marxist point. All right. Money in the future. Somebody said, would a Marxist say an uprising is necessary? Yes, a Marxist would say, you can't be, this is a quote from Marx, and Mendel points it out, you cannot be a scientific Marxist without being a revolutionary Marxist. There is no difference. If you meet any Marxist who says there is a difference, they're lying to you. Why? Because just Marxists can lie to a capitalist. That's the answer. But if you read their books, there is no difference between a scientific Marxist and a revolutionary Marxist, because they truly believe they have like a system of truth that will conclude with the collapse of capitalism. That is what they truly believe. So, and the collapse is, for a Marxist, morally good and leading to a more moral order. However, this point, Mandel, who, even though he's pre-fall of the Soviet Union, he's a bit, I'll say, black-pilled, but I'll explain that to you in a second. We'll get there. So first he says this. He says, money is the necessary materialization of abstract social labor. So, strictly speaking, Marxists aren't anti-money. So, value is connected to labor theory for a Marxist. In the end, what gives money value is it's the expression of your labor. That's what gives money value. And here's the funny part. This is where I said you don't have to be a Marxist for a Marxist to have a decent idea. This is actually pre-Marx. It comes from Ricardo and is even linked to Adam Smith. It's the idea that really value of money comes from... money's real value. People say, oh, it's the central bank or gold. That's a lie. Money's real value is your labor. Even in a capitalist system we have now, where it's like debt capitalism, the only true value in the system is your labor inputs. So the work you do is what money is. So money is just abstracted labor, right? It's your time expressed in a number. That's what it is. All right. So money itself is produced, which means money is also a commodity. Right? We make more money than we need. We trade money. Money isn't just used for like the exchange between a community. It's actually a commodity now too, which means it follows all these rules of Marxist thought. So the value of money, this is what a Marxist thinks. This is where they get the theory. A Marxist thinks the value of money should be the amount of value and labor needed to make items. So the value of money should be tied to labor. That's how we should value money in a Marxist conception. The goal of this theory, though, is to meld with history to be better than just economics. A Marxist will never do pure economics because they look at all their economic theory as historical theory and ethical theory. It's all together. So all this thing I explained about capital, they think all of these economic theories explain a historical method. And we'll talk about how that works on the slide I made next. It's my slide. All right. Now, what's the road out? Well, the road out, how do we escape this horribleness? If this is as horrible as Marxists say, what's the road out? Basically, the way Marxism works. I'll leave it up to you to decide if this is consistent. The road out is Marxist leaders are free of determinism. Now, let me say that again. Marxist leaders are free of determinism. Now, if you said, but Professor, I was pretty sure the material dialectic is a determinist dialectic. Yes, they believe that reality is driven by material. However, the only way to escape it is basically understanding Marx. So if you study and understand Marx, you become a Marxist leader. Therefore, you're then free of materialism, and more importantly, you're free of determinism because you understand determinism. So Marxists are determinists right until you understand Marx. Then you have free will. Now, don't get me wrong, a Marxist would say something more like, because you study Marx, you then change your determinism to be able to lead in a more socialist way. Sounds like free will to me, but it's an interesting, this is the exit vector. This is how you get out. All right. Now, the reality, and this is from Mandel, it's not my critique. Mandel points out the 19th and 20th century had some trouble for Marxists. For example, the reality was the Marxist revolutions only happened where bourgeoisie was the weakest. It didn't happen in Germany, didn't happen in the United States, didn't happen in France or England. It happened in Russia and China and places in South America. So where there's weak bourgeoisie, weak capitalism, the revolution was more likely to happen. Now, why would he say it? From Mandel's Marxist perspective, this is after Marx died, so Marx doesn't know this. Imperialism and education. Basically, imperialism kept the Western countries from having Marxist revolutions and encouraged the places that were, kind of victims of it to want to do it. And also, he feels deterministically the education in Western industrialized countries prevented them from having Marxist revolutions. And now this is funny. A lot of early Marxist thinkers think that socialism is the only logical end. There isn't another way for it to go. Now, interestingly, Mandel has a second alternative. Mandel would say, if socialism doesn't happen, barbarism is the alternative. Now, when you think of barbarism, this is his quote, not mine. Let me find the quote I had here. '86. So he has here, in the absence of a socialist revolution, capitalism will live on forever? A negative answer to the first question in no way implies a positive answer to the second. Indeed, classical Marxists following young Marx formulated their prognosis in the form of a dilemma: socialism or barbarism. So basically, socialists see the only two choices after capitalism. You either get socialism, or you get a complete collapse of the order. That is their view. Socialism is not the only end. Now, a lot of socialists never actually read Marx or this book. Why? It's a lot of work, and it's economics, and people don't like economics. But this is the two alternatives for a lot of Marxists: is either socialism or barbarism. Those are your choices. So welcome to you're a primer to Marx. If this intrigued you, I would say I recommend you read Marx. I would more say it this way. Marx might be a summer reading. If you think it's interesting, take a read. It's good to read it even if you disagree with it, because everybody, like, so much of our thought is influenced by Marx. It's good to know what his theory is. Okay, now what's my summary? Let me give you, this is now, we're leaving the book. We're leaving the true believer theory. We are now entering Professor Zeiser, not a true believer, spoiler. I know it's hard to believe, but not a true believer, so how would I give you a philosophical summary of this? And then we'll talk about how I use it as a tool. Alright, first, Marxists view themselves as scientific materialists. They do not see anything wherever I said belief or principles. Marxists think they're just following science. They do not think what I said is correct. They don't think it's anything but material science. Also, what is the good in Marxism? Labor is good. I don't say good just I like it good. Good means like capital G good in the ancient Roman and Greek sense, right? It is the good, it is the end, it is the morally upright thing. So labor is both good and exploited. And capital, aka business, is bad. And remember, bad just doesn't mean I don't like it. Bad means ethically wrong. And remember we talked about, as the quote said, right, it's all considered theft, piracy, slavery, exploitation. There is no good business for a Marxist. And they're all bad and exploiters, so morally wrong and exploiting people. And Marx, as a big system, is a critique of all capitalism and business. What are their blind spots? If you asked from an outsider view, most obvious would be government. In the system of belief that democratic means of production is better and appropriation by the state is more moral than by capitalists. That's basically... And can this have some truth if you disagree? Well, Mill would say, sure, right? We just studied John Stuart Mill, where he said, does a system, like, the one reason you should listen to systems you don't like is they might contain some truth. And there's even a different way to say it. I would say, for a system to have any appeal to humanity, it has to at least be true on some level, even if it's only like emotional truth, or like half the, like, for example, Marxism could critique capitalism correctly, but the answer might not be socialism, for example, right? That could also be true. Because it's not just, he's not just Marxist. Like socialism, half of Marxism is the critique of capitalism. And again, are they 100% wrong? Well, I can prove they're not 100% wrong, and I'll show you how. Our current crisis, where everything's collapsing. Just pointing that out, right? Like, if the system was, vigorous and strong, would the cough, would the sniffles knock out the whole economy? Probably not. So, okay, this is my little summary of Marx. Now, how we're going to use it, that's the next slide. The next slide is, how would you use this, right? So you're trying to understand, how do I analyze things using Marxist theory in a materialist perspective. And do we have enough time? Oh yeah, we got 25 minutes. We're doing great. Alright, oh, and by the way, if you missed any of this, it is still in the e-reserve too. So you could get the book and read the parts and then compare it. So for example, right, you then have to ask these kind of questions. So like we talked about before with materialism and determinism, right? You have to ask, like, what's the environment versus actions? What's material versus higher order, mystical or spiritual? You have to ask the question, like, who has agency, the people or groups, or are they all environmental and materialist factors? So, for example, normally we do this in class as a group, but I want to just kind of put it out for you, right? Like healthcare paid for by the government. And, of course, the government has no income, so that it means paid for by people. So, generally speaking, how do Marxists feel about this? It's a good question, right? Well, you could say, for example, why would a Marxist be for it? It's not just about, a lot of socialism has just become weird talking points, like everything that has a social interest is socialism. I've literally heard in American politics in the last 2 years somebody say, like, police and army are socialism. Police and army are not socialism. They're socialized responsibilities, but that's their government obligations. Everything the government does is not automatically socialism. That's only true for, like, fake modern socialists and libertarians. So basically, Healthcare is paid for by the government. Marxists would like it because you're increasing the material well-being of labor, right? That's why they would like it. But that doesn't make it necessarily socialist. Why would I say that? Like, for example, if I'm a capitalist, or let's say a free market person, or just a non-Marxist, is there a, like, let's say you're a nationalist, or just own a business, is there an interest for you in your work labor being cared for, or your co-nationals being cared for? Sure. But what's the Marxist argument for healthcare? The Marxist argument basically is increasing the well-being of labor. That's what would make it moral. Same thing with like public education, right? Would a Marxist love public education? Sure. And again, though, it's all about what are we focusing on. So they basically, public education, Marxists would like it. For example, not treating people different based on their situations. That's why they'd like it. And you're basically increasing the value of labor by allowing people to get an education, right? So then you're increasing their wage ability to earn a living, not a bad thing. Now, stuff like mental health, it's not just do Marxists like it or not like it, but like what answers are correct for a Marxist. So for example, it would interest you folks, psychology nowadays is basically materialist psychology. And let me explain what that means. In psychology, there's multiple sources of how the solution is. So in the old days, there was a competition, and there's still some of it there, but it was a competition between, I'm trying to find a good way to say this. There's a competition between, is your problem a chemical or environmental problem, or is your problem like a personal behavioral problem? That's the two branches of psychology, right? The personal behavioral problem is basically a liberal/traditional view. The environmental or chemical is a materialist view. So for example, in mental health, if every solution is an environmental or a chemical issue, that's basically a Marxist viewpoint, right? You're attributing causation to the material reality, not to like, you don't have meaning in your life. A Marxist has no point for that, really. Does that make sense? Like, all problems are basically material problems. Again, homelessness, there's two choices here, right? Is it the choice of the people on the streets, or is it like a reflection of the injustice of the means of production? Which one do you think is right? I'll leave that one to you. Wealth inequality, this one's the easiest. Why? Marxists believe that all capital is theft and unjust. So they critique wealth inequality quite often. Now, if there was wealth inequality in a society where we were all making our own labor, like we all got paid for our own labor, for Marxists that wouldn't actually be unjust. Just something to point out. Something like life failure in a Marxist sensibility, it's not necessarily a personal choice. They generally blame the system, especially if it's life failure for labor class. For bourgeoisie, they would say it was just. Oh, I have this example. We'll skip this one. I don't feel like it right now. Okay, so now the question comes, and you can type questions at any time. How do we apply this to our top paper topics? Well, like when we did our first paper, which was materialism we did determinism and will. You have to, when we're trying to attribute cause to things, you're basically asking, is the cause from the means of production, right? How we make our living, or is it from the material situation, right? Like the country we live in, the wealth of that country, the situation one was raised in, right? Are we attributing cause to material, or are we attributing cause to choices? If you find material causes are more compelling, your view tends to be more Marxist. That's what you should probably use in your paper. If you attribute more of your causation to choices, you can use more of a liberal theory. Now, I say more. Why? It's never 100%, right? Obviously, if you're born, say you have a liberal mindset, or just a traditional mindset, but you're born like super poor, and you have to work really hard to get into college, and you barely get a white-collar job. Did your poor situation affect you somewhat? Even if you're liberal, sure. A Marxist would attribute most of it to that. And then how you got out of it, they'd have to find a material explanation for it, so probably some kind of system. If you just said my hard work, I don't think they'd accept that. So, regardless of your viewpoint, right, you have to attribute some things to the other side, unless you're a pure ideologue. But just something to keep in mind. All right. let's see. Yeah, so keep that in mind. And even if you don't use Marxism, and let's be honest, if you're a random community member listening to this and you're like, man, I hate these guys, okay, but it's good to understand the other theoretical sides. Nowadays, people pretend there's not Marxists anymore. Folks, I'm in academia. A vast majority of academia is materialist. They might not call themselves Marxists, but they attribute things to material causes, and they basically follow the materialist dialectic. Like the whole psychology faculty is basically, a good percentage of psychology nowadays is this way. A lot of science is pure materialism. So it's good to remember that this has more influence than we might see on the surface. Being a Marxist doesn't mean somebody's registered with the Communist Party. It just means, where do they attribute the causation of human and scientific affairs? Something to keep in mind. All right, so this is the technical conclusion to Marx. You can ask me questions now. We're also going to switch to how I would structure your drafts for the last 20 minutes, and you can ask me questions about that too. But if you have any Marx questions, now's the time to ask those. I'll give us about a minute to let those hang. And you can also ask me after class when we're back in the voice chat, but if you have any questions now is the time. It does not look like we have any questions yet. So while you guys decide to ask me a question or not, I'm going to flip. Oh, here's a question. So, labor, in the eyes of Marxists, shows somebody is morally good. More correctly, it's not even shows. Marxists would claim a scientific truth that labor is morally good. Full stop. Always. If there's ever a tie between labor and capital, labor is always right. And by right, we mean righteous. Not just right as in correct, but right as in more true, right as in having the legitimate claim, right as in being morally correct. Basically, whenever there's a tie, the Marxists would argue they are correct. Morally speaking. Because labor's being exploited, basically, all the time, from a Marxist point of view. Here's another one. Somebody says, just think about my other class. How would Aristotle and Plato view Marx? Oh, neither of them would like them. Both Aristotle and Plato have a healthy appreciation. So for them, justice includes hierarchy. Does this make sense? So having hierarchy is just from a traditional mindset. Because it both is reality, but it's also just. Like, you shouldn't treat everyone the same. Now, Marxism has kind of devolved over time to say that just every labor should get paid the same. This is an interesting comment. One reason socialism in practice paid everyone similarly, it's not because that's actually good Marxism, it's because Marxists found out really quick there is no good way in an industrial society to calculate what exactly is my labor input. It's almost impossible to do. Unless I just make wallets in my garage. I'm at a professor in university. How much is the revenue that you guys generate for the university? How much is due to just my labor? How do we calculate that? How much of it's recruiting, and how much of it is paying the janitor, and how much is paying my professor's salary, right? How exactly do we calculate that? Spoiler, the Marxists tried for 100 years. They couldn't figure it out. So basically, they just paid everybody the same. Or at least everybody in a certain field would get paid the same. Now, the problem with that, of course, is it, in fact, distorts any outstanding thinkers. And also, over time, Marxists have gotten more and more against merit. Marxists view merit and excellence in Platonic or Aristotelian sense. They view techna as a trap of the bourgeoisie. They don't actually see it as a real thing. And then, of course, immediately, for example, in the Soviet Union, they make schools for excellent students where they give them a different track. So even Marxism has its own contradictions. Don't let a Marxist ever tell you it doesn't have it. Now, they will say that's just not perfect Marxism. I would just say they're running into reality. Their theory hit reality. So, again, not a Marxist. Spoiler. So, all right. Before we end, I want to do this really quick. Let me open it. Can I open just this slide? Yeah, I did it. Okay, so really quick, folks, we're going to spend the last 15 minutes on draft structure. So we got one more question. So Marxist ideals, in the eyes of Aristotle and Plato, would lead to an unjust society. Sorry, last question. You can ask more questions. So, for Aristotle and Plato, they would say Marxism is fundamentally unjust because you aren't giving people what they're owed, right? Like, everybody has their place in kind of the cosmic order for Aristotle and Plato. So, if you had like a great man being a janitor, just for the sake of equality, that is fundamentally unjust for a non-Marxist, especially for Aristotle and Plato. They would say, like, if a philosopher was forced to, move to a gulag and learn to farm and do hard labor, right? That's unjust because he's due more because of his capacity. Basically, that's how an Aristotelian or Platonic thought would think about it. It's a good question. And a spoiler, too, is why the Marxists don't like the classics, generally speaking. It's an argument against them. All right, let's keep going. So, okay, we have the drafts due in a couple weeks. How exactly would I structure it? Okay, so you only have to do 6 pages, but this is what I'd start to think about, both for your final paper, but also how are you going to draft. First, I would do an introduction, and I would do 1 to 2 pages. Give me your hook, give me your question, give me your thesis, give me where you think it may go, and then in your final paper, but for your draft too, you could start thinking about this. This one's harder to do now, but if you're ready for it, you could add it. Philosophy / methodology, 1 to 2 pages. So which major philosophy are you following? How is it informing your paper, and how are you planning to use it for your argumentation? That's a page or 2 easy. They're like, Professor, I can do a page or 2 on that? Of course. And most good academics will do this. They're not always as direct as saying, like, I'm using Marxist methodology. They'll be much more fancy about it. But we don't have to be that fancy. And then the majority of your draft should be this: source, analysis, and argumentation. So the reason I say you should have some inkling of your methodology in your introduction first, because that's how you do your analysis, right? A liberal analysis and a Marxist analysis, and let's be honest, some of you in my traditional Asia class, you could use Plato and Aristotle if you really want. So an Aristotelian analysis of a situation is fundamentally different from a Marxist one, but you should know which approach you want to use and why you're not using the other ones before you build too much of your argumentation. Trust me, it helps. So the majority of your draft should be this, though: a source, analysis, and argumentation. I'm not expecting you to be complete, but I want to see you start it. So I would highly recommend, every time people have done this, it's best organized into subtopics, sub-arguments, and sub-thesis that all connect back to your introductory thesis. So people who've talked to me in practicum hours, I've basically encouraged having 3 subsections to your papers, 3 subtopics. Let's say they're around 4 pages each. Then each subtopic so think about it this way: your goal should be to write intro, conclusion, and then 3 little 4-page papers that all are distinct, but they all tie back into your thesis, if this makes sense. So somebody asked, would it be better to add philosophy and methodology at the conclusion of the paper? No. Now, you should rewrite it at the end if you change your mind, but your analysis itself has a philosophy underneath it. If it's not explicit, you're going to necessarily mix your philosophies. Or worse, the worst one you can do, you just take the philosophy from the articles you're sorting. What's wrong with that? People are going to have different ones. Your paper can't be like 7 different methodologies. That wouldn't make any sense. So you need to know how you're doing the analysis. And next week we're going to get much more into how to turn philosophy into methodology. So try to keep it consistent. Fluid wasn't what I'd look for. Consistency, right? Try to be consistent in your analysis, and you can even say, like, where maybe one point of your argument where the Marxists may have a better point. You could even say what their point would be and why you don't think it disproves your argument. And then this is where your philosophy and your thesis come into play. Your thesis is what you're trying to prove, right? So every single argument in your sub-thesis and your subtopics ties back to what your main argument is. And again, this is where you are in the paper as a person. This is where you get your creative expression. And it's not an overstatement to say it's creative expression, right? The philosophy you pick and the thesis you pick and the way you connect your data in argumentation to it is where you express yourself, but it's also the connectivity of your paper. What keeps a 15-page paper going is, do you have that consistent argument? And a part of this is just deciding a thesis and jumping into it. And someday, of course, you'll have your conclusion in 1 or 2 pages. For the draft, you could get away with just this, right? Like, say you're a majority source analysis, and a little bit of intro and a little bit of philosophy. It's a draft. That's okay. But I'd highly recommend you should have at least an idea of what your methodology is, and you should have an introduction. Now, what do people do wrong on drafts? I'll tell you now. I'm a nice guy. Many people will only have introduction. That's bad. Or if you only have methodology, that's bad. Or if you only have source analysis with no introduction, no thesis, nothing. Any of those by themselves is not a good draft. You need a little bit of all of them. But I would say a majority should still be source analysis and argumentation. All right, and from next week, and I don't know if I have that in the conclusion. Let me see. I don't think I do. From next week, we are going to be doing Turabian on Tuesday. So we finished Marx. So we'll do Turabian, and then once we feel good about kind of structure, more structured detail from Turabian, like how do I do this argumentation? That's what we'll do on Tuesday. We're then going to get into Benedict Anderson's book, but there'll be we'll have a form week or two. And I'm going to end the stream here, but we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to be back in the Discord where you all can ask me questions specifically about the draft work. And for those of you who join the stream who aren't students, thank you very much. I'll be back at 12:30 streaming St. Augustine if you're curious. And for everybody else, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Have a beautiful day.